The figure Americans say they need to feel financially secure in retirement by 2026 stands at $1.46 million. The actual median savings of a middle-class household that hasn't yet retired sits at around $67,000. And here's the part no retirement planning tool will ever say directly to your face. Statistically speaking, at 43, you've already crossed the halfway point of your prime wealth building period. But you still have enough time to arrive somewhere completely different depending on the choices you make over the next 5 to 7 years. Not 10, not 20. 5 to 7. That is the window, and it is already open. Over the past decade, running a business alongside fiscal attorneys and accountants gave me a front row seat to how money actually behaves, not how financial marketing wants you to believe it behaves. I personally have multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars actively invested in the market right now. So none of this is theory, and the pattern I keep observing is consistent. People at 43 believe they're somewhere in the middle of the game. They're not. They are in the final phase of the setup. Everything that happens after 50 is largely about playing the hand you've already been given. This video is about understanding exactly what cards you're holding right now and the specific actions that can still change where you finish. Here's what I'll be walking you through. There are 4 forces working at the same time at age 43 that will determine whether you're living comfortably at 65 or struggling at 72. I'm going to walk you through every single one. I'll show you the math, and I'll walk you through a real-world comparison of 2 individuals who began from the same starting point and ended up in completely different retirements. Not because of luck, not because of income, because of decisions. But before we get there, in a few minutes, I'm going to share a statistic about what actually happens to stable, long-term employed workers between age 50 and retirement. It changes the entire way you should be thinking about your timeline. Most financial content avoids this number entirely because it completely dismantles the most comforting assumption people hold about when they'll stop working. But first, let's talk about what makes 43 uniquely different from 42 or even 44. I refer to it as the launch window problem, and it's the central idea this entire video is built around. Let me frame it properly. When a spacecraft is sent toward a specific orbital destination, there exists a narrow window, sometimes only minutes long, where the angles, velocities, and gravitational geometry all line up correctly. Miss that window, and the rest of the mission becomes about correcting course, burning through reserve fuel, arriving behind schedule, or potentially missing the destination entirely. The laws of physics don't hold a grudge against you. They simply don't make exceptions. Compound interest operates the same way. It doesn't grow in a straight line. It grows exponentially, which means missing the window by a decade doesn't just cost you 10 years of growth. It costs you the exponential output of those 10 years as they compound through everything that comes after. At 43, you are still inside the retirement launch window. The trajectory is still adjustable. The math still works powerfully in your favor. But the window is narrowing, not simply with the passing of years, but with every passing decision. And the window doesn't close because you've run out of money. It closes the moment the math has shifted beyond your ability to correct it. That's when things get quiet and expensive. This is the launch window. It matters. There are 4 things happening simultaneously at 43 that I want to break apart carefully. The order they're in matters because they build on each other in ways most people never see. Let's begin with the one that is both the most important and the most consistently overlooked. You might think the problem at 43 is simply not saving enough. That's a genuine problem. But the deeper issue underneath that one is that most people at 43 are building their retirement plan on top of an assumption that real-world data has already proven wrong. The assumption is this, that they will remain employed until the retirement date they've chosen. The majority of them won't. More than half won't. And that's not speculation or pessimism. That comes from a joint analysis conducted by ProPublica and the Urban Institute using data drawn from the Health and Retirement Study, a long-running panel research project funded by the Social Security Administration and the National Institutes of Health. The findings showed that more than half of workers who entered their 50s with stable long-term employment People who had been with the same employer for a minimum of 5 years, solid performance records, no visible warning signs. More than 56% of them were pushed out of those jobs involuntarily before reaching their intended retirement age. Not because they chose to leave, but because of layoffs, or because pay and working conditions deteriorated to the point where staying was no longer a reasonable option, or because a corporate acquisition made their position redundant. 56%. And here's the part that makes it worse. This pattern doesn't discriminate the way most people expect it to. Among long-term workers who hold only a high school diploma, 58% face serious involuntary job loss after 50. Among those with college or graduate degrees, that number is 55%, 3 percentage points lower. Education does not shield you from this. Your industry, your seniority level, your performance reviews, none of these factors offer the protection most people assume they do. Age discrimination complaints filed with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission reached 16,223 in 2024, up from 11,500 in 2022. The trend is heading in the wrong direction. The financial consequences of a premature job separation are serious and frequently permanent. The typical older household loses approximately 42% of its income when one member exits employment before planned. And even among those who find new positions, which takes longer and becomes harder the older you are, very few ever recover to their previous income level. So when you're 43 and thinking you have another 22 years of contributions ahead of you, the realistic planning figure is probably closer to 10 to 15 years before something interrupts that plan. Not because you're being negative, because the data supports it. Why does this matter specifically at 43 and not at 50? Because 43 is the last point at which you have enough runway to construct a financial cushion capable of absorbing an involuntary exit at 53 or 55 without it becoming catastrophic to your long-term retirement outcome. By 48, the math on building that buffer gets significantly harder. By 52, most of the available leverage is already gone. This is the launch window. You're still inside it. But the key insight here isn't simply save more. It's save with a fundamentally different target in mind. The target isn't a retirement date you control. The target is a financial position strong enough to survive a retirement date being chosen for you. Stay with me, because this next section changes everything. This is where the actual arithmetic of being 43 becomes both clarifying and sobering at the same time. Here is the single most important mathematical truth about your current age. 10 years of contributions between 43 and 53 are not equivalent to 10 years of contributions between 53 and 63. Not even remotely close. The first decade is worth roughly double the second, and in some scenarios even more. And I mean that in precise compounding terms, not motivational poster language. Let me be specific. Take $50,000, invest it today at 43 at a 7% annual return. That's roughly in line with a long-term real return on a diversified equity portfolio. 22 years from now, at 65, that $50,000 has grown to approximately $221,000. That's what the compound growth formula produces. $50,000 multiplied by 1.07 raised to the 22nd power. Now delay that by 10 years. The same $50,000 invested at 53, the same 7% return. By 65, you've had 12 years instead of 22. That same $50,000 grows to roughly $113,000. The cost of that 10-year delay on a single lump sum is around $108,000. You effectively paid more than double your original investment in opportunity cost simply by waiting a decade. Apply that same logic to monthly contributions. $500 per month beginning today at 43, compounding at 7% annually over 22 years, produces somewhere around $311,000. The identical $500 per month starting at 53, over 12 years at the same return, produces roughly $113,000. The difference is nearly $200,000, generated simply by $500 a month starting earlier. And that second 12-year window assumes you still have consistent income. Given what we just discussed about involuntary workforce exits, That runway after 53 could easily shrink to 6 years or 3 or 0. Three levers operate inside the launch window that simply don't function the same way outside it. Lever 1 is maximizing the base. In 2026, the 401k employee contribution limit is $24,500. If you're not reaching that number, you're leaving tax-advantaged compounding on the table. Compounding that is dramatically more valuable at 43 than it will be at 52 because it has more years to run. Your employer match is free money, and any contribution below the match threshold represents one of the only guaranteed returns that genuinely exists in investing. The 401k system was designed to help people accelerate contributions later in life. At 50, the catch-up contribution activates, allowing an additional $8,000 per year for a total of $32,500 in 2026. But the catch-up provision only matters if you built a meaningful foundation before it became available. Lever 2 is tax structure positioning. At 43, you're likely sitting in a higher income bracket than you'll occupy in early retirement. That makes traditional pre-tax contributions strategically valuable. You defer tax today at your higher rate and potentially pay it at a lower rate during retirement. But Roth conversions executed strategically in your mid-40s, while your balance is still relatively manageable, establish years of tax-free compounding that you'll be grateful for at 63. This is a decade-level tax decision that most people postpone indefinitely because it doesn't feel urgent. It's just important. Lever 3 is reducing the drag, and this is the one that produces the most visceral reaction when people actually examine the numbers up close. By the way, if you're finding this useful, go ahead and hit subscribe. The algorithm may not surface this kind of content to you again otherwise. There's a specific category of financial damage that never appears as a labeled line item on your investment statement. It's not marked as a fee or a cost, it simply shows up as a smaller final number decades from now. And it comes from something the industry has quietly made seem normal: the expense ratio of actively managed funds. Here's the figure. $100,000 invested at an 8% gross annual return over 30 years in a fund charging 0.05%, which is what a basic S&P 500 index fund typically costs, grows to approximately $992,000. Call it $1 million. That same $100,000, the same 30 years, the same gross market return, inside a fund charging 1%, which is not an unusual expense ratio for an actively managed mutual fund and is actually on the lower end of active management costs, grows to approximately $761,000. The difference is $231,000 from a single percentage point on $100,000. That's not a rounding error. That's a vehicle, a college education, or a decade of retirement income. Scale that up to a $500,000 portfolio. Analysis published by LPL Financial shows that a $500,000 portfolio, earning 7% gross over 30 years with a 0.5% annual fee, grows to roughly $3.3 million. The identical portfolio with a 1.5% fee grows to approximately $2.5 million. The gap is more than $815,000. A fee difference of just 1% costs you $815,000 in compound growth. That figure exceeds the total retirement savings of most Americans. And what makes it maddening is that most people have no idea what they're paying. The expense ratio doesn't come out of your paycheck. It comes out of your fund's returns before the number ever reaches your statement. You never write a check for it. You never receive an invoice. It simply erodes silently every year, compounding in reverse while your returns compound forward. Except the fee always wins because it never has a bad year. The data tracking whether active managers outperform their benchmark after fees shows that over periods of 15 or more years, active managers underperform the index roughly 85 to 90% of the time. So you're paying more for inferior results on a compounding drag that multiplies across time. At 43, with 22 years of runway remaining before 65, that 1% fee has 22 full years to quietly extract from your compounding base. This is the launch window metaphor again. A 1% fee is a 1-degree error at launch. At liftoff, it looks completely trivial. $231,000 later, you're off target in a way that can't be corrected mid-flight. Here's something worth pausing on before moving to the next section. The math is one thing. Actually, constructing a system around that math is something else entirely. Years spent studying the research on retirement failure patterns reveal that the gap is almost never about people being unaware of the rules. It's about not having a practical framework that converts those rules into specific numbers, specific dates, and specific decisions that apply to their actual situation. There's a resource built specifically for this called the Exit Code. It's an 8-chapter digital book grounded in 50 years of actual retirement data, compressed into a mathematical framework designed to help you exit the workforce on your own terms. 2 sections are directly relevant to what we've covered so far. The first covers the 56% statistic, the data behind involuntary workforce exits, and the specific buffer size needed to avoid the cascade failure we'll discuss shortly. The second introduces the dynamic withdrawal method, which replaces the standard 4% rule with something that genuinely accounts for sequence of returns risk in the critical first decade of retirement, the decade that can make or break everything else. It costs less than a meal out. You'll find the link in the description below. And now, let me show you why that sequence risk matters far more than most people realize. Now for the third force operating at 43. Most people believe the primary threat to a retirement portfolio is a market decline. That's not the real risk. The actual risk is the timing of when that decline occurs. Specifically, whether it happens in the first 5 to 10 years after you begin making withdrawals from your portfolio. Here's why the sequence matters so much. 2 retirees can have the exact same average annual return over 20 years, the exact same figure on paper. But if one of them experiences the losing years early while simultaneously making withdrawals to cover living expenses, their portfolio depletes at a dramatically faster pace than the retiree whose bad years came later. When you're forced to sell investments during a downturn just to pay your bills, those shares are permanently gone. They cannot participate in the eventual recovery. The portfolio base shrinks precisely at the moment you need it to be growing. Early losses combined with ongoing withdrawals reduce the portfolio at a pace that later gains simply cannot reverse. Research from Charles Schwab describes this as sequence of returns risk. The order and timing of poor investment returns can have a substantial impact on how long your retirement savings actually last. Researchers describe the period of greatest exposure as the retirement red zone, covering the 5 years before retirement and the first 10 years after. During that window, your portfolio is at or near its highest value, which means any losses have the maximum possible time to compound against you. If you're 43 right now, your red zone begins at approximately 57 or 58. You have roughly 15 years to build both a portfolio and a withdrawal structure that won't catastrophically collapse if the market drops 30% in the first year of your retirement. Most people don't discover sequence of returns risk until they're 63. By that point, the only available responses are defensive. This is where a profile I'll call Marcus becomes relevant. Marcus isn't someone I know personally, but the pattern he represents is one I've encountered repeatedly across many different conversations. Marcus is 51 now. He built a solid career in corporate finance, stayed with the same company for 11 years, and fully expected to retire comfortably at 63. His plan looked reasonable on paper, about $240,000 in his 401k, and his thinking was that 12 more years of contributions at his current rate would get him where he needed to be. At 51, his company was acquired. His role was labeled redundant. He received 8 months of severance. He assumed he'd be working again within 3 to 6 months. He wasn't. By 53, he had found part-time consulting work at roughly 60% of his previous income. The 2-year gap cost him not only the missed 401k contributions, approximately $48,000 in compounding that simply no longer exists, but he also drew down $12,000 from savings to cover health insurance premiums during that period. He was 51 to 53, not 65. Medicare was still 12 years away. The marketplace premiums he faced exceeded $1,000 per month, and his income during the gap disqualified him from most available subsidies. His neighbor David is also 51. Same industry, similar income history throughout his career. But David had made deliberate decisions at 43. He maxed his 401k contributions for 7 consecutive years before turning 50, shifted all his holdings into low-cost index funds during his late 30s, and built a 12-month cash buffer specifically designed to absorb an involuntary job exit without requiring him to touch his investment accounts. David was laid off at 52. Same economic disruption, same industry. He was out of work for 14 months. He didn't make any meaningful changes to his lifestyle. His buffer absorbed the gap. He eventually returned to work, but from a position of genuine choice rather than financial desperation. His sequence of returns exposure was managed because his buffer meant he didn't have to liquidate assets during the market downturn that coincided with his employment gap. Marcus and David earned similar incomes for the majority of their careers. The difference between their retirement outcomes was constructed during the launch window. The decisions made between 40 and 50, not the decisions made at 51 when everything became urgent. Let me put specific numbers to this. Call this person Kevin. Kevin is 43. He earns $120,000 a year. He currently has $85,000 in his 401k. His employer matches contributions up to 4%. He has no other significant investment portfolio. In Trajectory 1, Kevin does what the majority of Americans do. He contributes just enough to capture the employer match, 4%. That works out to approximately $4,800 per year from Kevin, plus $4,800 in employer matching, totaling around $9,600 per year going into his account. Starting from $85,000 at 7% annual return over 22 years, Kevin ends up with approximately $760,000. That sounds like a meaningful number until you account for 3% annual inflation eroding purchasing power throughout a 30-year retirement, and the $172,500 that Fidelity's 2025 research identifies as the average amount a retiree needs for healthcare expenses alone. His real usable retirement pool shrinks considerably. At a 4% withdrawal rate, he's generating somewhere between $23,000 and $25,000 per year from his portfolio before Social Security. And that assumes he arrives at 65 with everything intact, which the 56% statistic suggests is not the most likely outcome. In Trajectory 2, Kevin maxes his 401k starting today at $24,500 per year. Beginning from the same $85,000 base and maxing contributions for 22 years at 7%, Kevin ends up closer to $1.8 million. He's crossed the $1.46 million threshold that Americans currently identify as the amount needed for a comfortable retirement. In Trajectory 3, Kevin does everything in Trajectory 2, but he also audits and replaces the funds in his lineup. His 401k had been defaulted into actively managed funds averaging 1% in expense ratios. He switches to index equivalents at 0.07%. On a portfolio growing toward $2 million over 22 years, the fee savings compound to somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000 in additional dollars at retirement. Trajectory 3 produces roughly $2 million or more. Trajectory 1 and Trajectory 3 start from an identical position. Same salary, same age, same current balance. They diverge entirely based on decisions Kevin makes within the next 60 days. That is how asymmetric the launch window truly is. Now for the fourth and final variable that most retirement projections either leave out entirely or model incorrectly when they do include it. Social Security timing is mathematically one of the most consequential financial decisions a person makes across their entire lifetime. And whether that decision gets made well or poorly is almost entirely determined by choices made in your 40s, not your 60s. Here is the math. For anyone born in 1960 or later, full retirement age is 67. Claim at 62, the earliest allowed age, and your monthly benefit is permanently reduced by as much as 30%. Wait until 70, the latest point at which deferring increases your benefit, and your monthly check is 24% higher than it would have been at 67. This is because every year of delay past full retirement age adds 8% in delayed retirement credits. In actual dollar terms, Someone with a projected monthly benefit of $2,000 at their full retirement age of 67 collects $1,400 per month at 62 and $2,480 per month at 70. That is a 77% difference in monthly income for life, with cost of living adjustments applied to the higher starting base. Over a 20-year retirement, the cumulative difference between claiming at 62 versus waiting until 70 exceeds $200,000. For many people, it represents the single largest financial decision of their lives, surpassing most investment choices. But here's where the trap closes. Waiting until 70 only works if you have sufficient assets to bridge the gap, meaning you can cover your living expenses without touching Social Security at between 65 and 70. Specifically, 5 years of lifestyle costs plus healthcare coverage. And that healthcare bridge for someone retiring before Medicare eligibility at 65 is not a minor consideration. Benchmark marketplace premiums at age 62 run over $1,070 per month per person. At 63, over $1,100 per month. At 64, over $1,120 per month. That's before deductibles, copays, or any actual medical utilization. This is where everything converges. The person who gets involuntarily pushed out at 55, remember 56% of stable workers face this, who has no buffer, who cannot sustain $12,000 or more per year in health insurance premiums while simultaneously drawing down savings, who has no option but to claim Social Security at 62 just to survive financially. That person just permanently locked in 30% less monthly income for the remainder of their life. Not because they made a poor Social Security decision, because they didn't have a buffer, because they didn't build one during the window. The cascade plays out like this. No buffer at 43 leads to an involuntary exit at 55, which leads to healthcare gap costs that drain savings faster than projected, which leads to claiming Social Security at 62 instead of 70, which leads to a permanent 30% reduction in monthly income for the rest of life, which leads to a retirement that looks nothing like the plan that existed on paper. This is a cascade failure. It begins at 43. The opposite is a cascade success. David, Marcus's neighbor, built one by making the right choices during the launch window. When the disruption arrived, he had 3 things that the cascade failure individual didn't. A buffer to absorb involuntary job loss without liquidating investment accounts. A fee structure low enough that his compounding wasn't being silently extracted. And enough financial flexibility to delay Social Security past 67. Incidentally, the median annual cost of a private nursing home room in 2024 was $127,750, and Medicare doesn't cover it. But that's an entirely separate conversation. The average financial advisor in the United States charges approximately 1% of assets under management. If you have $500,000 with them, you're paying $5,000 annually for a portfolio that, per the available data, underperforms a basic index fund the vast majority of the time over 15 or more years after fees are applied. The conversation typically sounds something like this. We've assembled a diversified, actively managed allocation calibrated to your specific risk profile. The translation is, we've chosen a strategy with a fee structure sufficient to cover compensation, and we've framed it as something sophisticated. That's not a blanket condemnation of every financial advisor. Some are genuinely excellent, and real value exists in tax planning and behavioral guidance. But 1% compounding against you over 22 years on a growing portfolio isn't advice. It's arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't respond to sales language.